Welcome to week 5 of VSM 102. Here's the lecture notes for today. And in week 5 and week 6, we're going to be talking about accounting. And today we're going to focus that our use of the accounting tool on water resources and carbon. So the themes for today is that this approach of using accounting is more about creating an information system to help us make good environmental decisions. So it's not just about counting stuff, it's about setting it up so the information we gather is useful for making these decisions. And we're going to see two examples of that. The carbon footprint is one you're probably familiar with, and I want to explore that a little bit as how that relates to accounting. And then the other thing is to look at water availability and usability, the amount and quality of that water, and how that is can be studied using an accounting approach and will help us make some sorts of decisions. Now, just a fact to motivate us to learn about water, which is that we could meet all of our country's energy demands with solar panel and wind, but what we really need is, and that would be very useful, but there's really no technical fix similar to that for water. We have an overconsumption of water in some areas of the country, and that is going to require, that causes a much different sort of environmental problem and environmental dilemma for us. So today's lecture is going to have three parts. First part is going to be just about environmental accounting, with carbon footprint being the example. And part two is going to be water demand and availability. And then part three, we're going to look at some examples of using a full life cycle analysis on two types of water questions. So as I said before, environmental accounting is not just about keeping track of just the numbers, but it's setting up a system. And environmental accounting is a really good way to address information problems. And just to review, those information problems are where we have good alignment of values, but we need more information. And the other types of, and so setting up a way to gather the information and make that decision is really key here. The other examples of these four types of problems, easy problems for regulations, we would use an accounting system, I'm sure, to follow whether we were really making the changes we thought in the environment. And for community-based problems, we might use accounting methods to collect information on people, similar, but it's not a really key process there. And for wicked problems, which are both information and political, I'm sure we would use environmental accounting as a underpinning of much of the study, but it wouldn't necessarily lead to the sort of decision. So information problems are really perfect to apply this accounting approach. So the idea is that we're going to, in accounting, we're going to have this process. There's a real event that happens. Something actually happens in in the environment, the economy, and social structure, and we have some way of observing that. But when we observe it, it comes through a filter. That could be our own perception. It could be the data loggers we use. So, for example, when I'm studying lakes, all the information, or most of the information I get and understanding lake, comes through data loggers. So for me, the actual event that happens in the lake showed up in temperature or dissolved oxygen. Then we're going to observe that. When we make that observation, we're going to make a report. We're going to process that data, turn it into information in some sort of context. But then it's up to in order to make a decision, we're going to have to interpret and apply some sort of value judgment to see what decision is going to be made. And so a shortcut here is that in order to make this decision, we have an abstraction of the event. And the abstraction is to filter, process, and interpret. So setting up a system to collect the proper information and create reports so that they can be interpreted, that's the goal of environmental accounting. So accounting has several objectives that help us make good decisions. The first, these are completeness, non-overlapping, and to create accounts. So first is completeness. We should make sure we capture all the important information. And this in some simple systems, this is pretty easy. Just draw a boundary around the problem, collect all the information like we might with a systems problem. For others, it's going to be very squishy. We're going to there might be a judgment calls, what's significant or insignificant, and what information we should include. Once we have that sort of boundary around everything, we would want to make non-overlapping accounts or bins that we'd put this information into. This is going to really help us make decisions because we would have categorized the information, and I'm going to show you an example of that in just a second. And then we actually create those accounts. We create all that information. We find that information someplace. We create accounts, and then from that we might build indexes and indicators. Now next week we're going to talk about those indexes and indicators, but just for example, I'm going to skip to that right here, this information pyramid. Here's all the basic statistics, this information that has been collected and turned into reports and put into available information. Then we separate those out into accounts, and I'm going to show you in a second what that might mean for water in terms of quantity and quality. And then we might produce an overall indicator that's easy to follow and helps us know if we're generally going in the right direction. But because you can follow it more easily, more eyes are on it, more people are participating in it. To go from the accounts to the basic statistics, this is a really sort of technical operation. Might be hard for a lot of people to follow. So back to environmental accounting here. Here's an example of how we might do this. A quick example for water, which is we would going through the process here, what are all the types of water, the sources and flows, and so count for all the water. That's the completeness. Then what's the quality of that water? What are the water quality standards that are applied to those water in all of those different sources and flows? Are they drinkable? Can you swim in it? Can you use it for recreation? That sort of thing. And then what information do you need to make a decision? That becomes the report, and then actually making that decision is the purpose of getting all this information together. And then we might also use that same information to present on an ongoing basis to see if we're going in the right direction. That's creating an index or some more easily understandable piece of information. Okay, I also want to explain that accounting is different than economics. So in order to do economics, which might focus on economic and social valuations of particular environmental resources, it really has to be based a lot on strong accounting principles to find that information and compile it and make it available so that that can be studied. So here's an example. Like, it's very difficult to, economists might study the preferences for different qualities of water, and it's very difficult to infer that directly from the source of data, so that's where economists would come in and study how people's preferences related to that. Now there's a couple other examples that are given in the book. I'm not going to discuss them. I'm just going to mention them here, but in the book they're just given as outlines in any case. But you can go to this link and see a little increase, and they deal with a few of these issues. For example, RED, which stands for Reduced Emission from Deforestation and Destruction. One of the things that this study deals with is what is the issue of transboundary leakage. So for example, in Bolivia they wanted to set up a national park and exclude forest harvesting, but what if that company just goes over next door in Ecuador and harvests the forest there? That's a question of transboundary leakage. They're trying to preserve the carbon in the trees, but if they just cut more trees next door, how can you study that? Another example down here, local Tualatin River and the combined water and sewer. They needed a way to process the water that comes out of the Tualatin Sewer District, so they could sewer plant so it was at a lower temperature. And the standard way is to build a cooling tower, but in this case they were able to use environmental accounting to show all the benefits and all the costs and benefits for having a enormous wetland that cooled the water and then released water into the Tualatin River at the right time. And it was so important because the standard procedure would be to build a cooling tower. So the onus of proof was on the environmental accounting process to show that actually the other project was preferable. Okay, let's look at an example of an index you're probably pretty familiar with, which is ecological carbon footprint. So we have the carbon footprint, which takes into account the land used directly for constructing a project and the amount of productive or biologically productive land it would take to take up the CO2 produced during that project. And this carbon footprint, I'm sure you've seen it as individuals to do a worksheet to show what your carbon footprint is. And this really just gets at your individual use, and it rolls all of these different measurements about here's how much carbon was used to create hot water, here's how much carbon you used to drive your car. It rolls them all into one indicator, which is how much land would it take to balance your particular carbon production. So for individuals, it's very used to understand their personal impact and to see which of the things they do in their life they might reduce some and reduce that carbon impact. Similarly, it's good for businesses to reduce their carbon emissions and to also do this in a comparative manner to see which of the processes create the most carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and which ones they might be able to cut down the most cost effectively. And one of the ways, in some countries they get tax breaks for this and they get or incentives. The United States, it's often that we would just do it because the company wants to both seem greener, that is maybe for public relations and for public standing, but also to look at these efficiencies of their practices. If energy expenditures are one of your big environmental impact from or one of your big costs for your business, then reducing energy expenditure somehow would decrease your carbon footprint and save you money. And then environmental groups use this as a financial tool. So with businesses that want to reduce their carbon emissions, they might pay somebody else to plant trees or to reduce deforestation or maintain forests that are there that might otherwise be cut down or protect carbon sinks. And this sort of idea is called an offset. So the company creates excess carbon emission and they pay somebody else to take up that carbon in some sort of forest or plantation. So here's generally how that carbon offset works, which is we have carbon emission by some plant. I've shown a plant here with smokestacks, but this could be a car driving, it could be an airplane flight with excess carbon emissions coming from that. And the people who make these emissions want to offset that. They want to say, well, we put out so many tons of carbon in the atmosphere, and we paid for somebody else to offset that, so we get an offset credit. And on the other side, we have some forest management group that's going to manage a forest to take up CO2. So what happens is in the middle there's a bank. So the bank certifies that this forest took up so much CO2, so many tons of CO2 per year. And then they sell that credit to the business that's that has excess CO2 emission. So the business pays the bank, and the bank pays the forest, and the bank keeps a little bit of money for itself as part of the transaction fee. So this is how the offset generally would work. And so the advantages of this is you can have CO2 emissions, and these people can keep their company running and spend money in an effective manner to run their plant and maybe reduce overall emissions. But when it comes down to it, if they have extra CO2, they could pay for a forest to grow that, and then this forest would be either a new forest growing or a forest that they bought and kept from being cut down. So all of those sorts of things benefit the environment. Okay, now just back to the CO2 emissions for a second. One of the things that it takes in order to understand these carbon footprints is a database of what each process, how much energy that uses or what its carbon footprint is. And that's where businesses, such as carbonfootprint.com, will provide. They have a database. If you pay to have them help you do your carbon footprint, they have a database of what each machine or each process, how much carbon, what's the carbon footprint of that. Say, for example, a Xerox machine, copying paper in your office, how much carbon does that contribute to the atmosphere each year? So that's the sort of advantage. You need that sort of information available to do this footprint analysis. Now I'm going to finish this section by just an example of how much energy what's the CO2 footprint of driving a car. And this has two components. One is the amount of land that's taken up by the roads, and the other is the amount of CO2 that's produced by the car, by operating the car, and that CO2 and how much land it would take to balance that CO2 that comes out of the car and is used for making the roads. So just working through the numbers, if we have a car that gets 11 kilometers per gallon of gas, and we're going to have each gallon of gas that's burnt puts 2.36 kilograms of CO2 into the atmosphere, then we would be producing 0.21 kilograms of CO2 per kilometer driven per year. Now, in addition to that, in addition just how much gas it takes to operate a car, it's about 15% of that for maintenance. So that's 0.03 kilograms. And another 30% of the gas costs for road construction, so about 0.6 kilograms. And when you look at the overall carbon footprint, 54% comes from the gas, 8% of the total comes from this maintenance, and 16% of it comes from building the road, grinding up the gravel and transporting it and making the asphalt. Now, if you take all of those, you add those numbers together for how much CO2 is produced, you get 0.3 kilograms CO2 per kilometer driven per year, and you multiply it by the productivity of the land, which is how much CO2 the vegetation takes up per meter squared. So you get 1.92 meters squared per kilogram CO2 per year. You multiply those out and you get about 0.6 meters squared per car per kilometer per year. So for each kilometer you drive your car each year, you have to balance it with 0.6 meters squared of productive land. Okay, now there's also land taken out of productivity because you're building the road, and that ends up being this number down here, which is take all of the roadway in the country and divide it by the number of kilometers driven. You get 0.17 meters squared per car per kilometer per year. And this number, then you add these two together and you get a total of 0.76 meters squared is necessary to offset every kilometer you drive your car in a year. Now, to put that doesn't really mean too much, but let's say you commuted 10 kilometers to work each way, 230 working days a year, so they're just for commuting, and you'd multiply the number of days, the distance, the number of days, the number of meters squared per kilometer you need, and it would end up you'd need about 3,500 square meters just to balance the commuting use of one car for one person. So that's about the size of a football field. So again, the point of this carbon footprint analysis is it takes a bunch of different information like this, all these different things, like where did they get these numbers about maintenance? Well, they studied how much energy it takes and how much oil changes cost and all those sorts of things for a broad population and number of cars, and they come up with sort of an estimate like this. You take all that sort of information and you put it and you condense it all into one, and then you turn it into this, this one number, this sort of index that people can understand, which is this footprint, amount of land area that would be required just to balance the carbon emission from that one activity. Now, this doesn't include where we got the gas or any sort of other air pollution issues or anything like that. It's just these four things: the gas, the maintenance, the building the road itself, and the land taken out of production. All right, we're going to move on to part 2, and in part 2 you'll see we're going to look at water requirements.